The CNN studio was a cathedral of light and tension, every camera trained on the two figures at center stage. On one side, Alan Dershowitz, the legendary Harvard law professor emeritus, sat with a stack of annotated papers and the air of a man who had spent decades lecturing the nation's brightest legal minds. On the other, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, her maroon suit catching the glow of the spotlights, waited with a calm that seemed to defy the gravity of the moment. The audience, a mix of legal scholars, political junkies, and everyday viewers, sensed they were about to witness something more than a policy debate. This was a generational collision, old power versus new conviction, reputation versus preparation. The moderator, Rebecca Mitchell, welcomed the audience and introduced the guests. Tonight, we're joined by Professor Alan Dershowitz, whose legal career has spanned more than half a century, and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, a rising star in the House and co-sponsor of the Voting Rights Protection Act. The camera cut to Dershowitz, who smiled with the confidence of a man who had argued before the Supreme Court and won. "Thank you, Rebecca," he said, his Boston accent crisp. "I've been teaching constitutional law since before the Congresswoman was born. I think Americans deserve to hear from someone who truly understands the Constitution." The condescension was unmistakable. He lifted his stack of papers, yellow highlights visible, as if to remind everyone of his academic stature. Crockett, unfazed, adjusted her gold necklace and leaned forward. "Good evening," she began, her voice smooth but firm, carrying the subtle warmth of her Texas roots. "Unlike some, I'm not here to lecture Americans from an ivory tower. I'm here to discuss how this legislation protects real communities I've served in court and now in Congress." Rebecca nodded, sensing the friction. "Let's begin. Professor Dershowitz, you've called this bill unconstitutional. Congresswoman Crockett, you're a co-sponsor. What's truly at stake here?" Dershowitz jumped in before Crockett could answer. "What's at stake," he said sharply, "is the balance of power. Congress is overreaching. The Constitution gives states, not Washington, the authority to run elections. Frankly, I'm surprised someone with a law degree would support such an unconstitutional power grab." Crockett's lips curved into a faint smile, not of amusement, but of recognition. She had seen this tactic before, men with titles using arrogance as a weapon. What Dershowitz didn't know was that Crockett had spent the weekend reviewing his own writings from the 1970s and 1980s, essays that directly contradicted his current stance. She had even spoken with 3 of his former students, gathering insights into his debate weaknesses. Her team had prepared for every line of attack. "Professor," Crockett replied, "constitutional interpretation isn't just for Ivy League professors. It belongs to every American whose rights depend on it." Dershowitz raised an eyebrow, ready to interrupt, but Crockett continued, her voice unwavering. "You claim I misunderstand constitutional law. Let's look at the text. Article 1, Section 4 clearly gives Congress authority over federal elections. The 14th and 15th Amendments reinforce Congress's power to protect voting rights. That's not theory. It's written law." The studio fell silent. Crockett had just turned what was supposed to be a lecture into a master class of her own. Dershowitz shook his head, clearly irritated at being corrected on something as basic as constitutional law. "Congresswoman," he said with a thin smile, "I'm well aware of those clauses, but the Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld state control over elections. Shelby County v. Holder, for example." "I'm very familiar with Shelby County," Crockett interrupted smoothly. "I've personally litigated voting rights cases affected by that ruling. The issue isn't whether states have authority, it's whether they're abusing that authority to silence voters." Dershowitz's expression tightened. "That's exactly the kind of emotional, non-legal rhetoric that muddies this entire debate. The Constitution doesn't promise easy voting. It promises equal protection under the law." Crockett didn't hesitate. When voting restrictions target certain communities more than others, that's not about convenience. It's about constitutional harm. Rebecca, sensing the rising heat, tried to steer things back. "Let's discuss the details of the bill. Professor, you've criticized the section that mandates a minimum number of early voting days. Why is that?" Dershowitz leaned forward, energized. This is where Congress clearly crosses the line. States are not identical. They have different populations, budgets, and needs. Imposing a one-size-fits-all rule from Washington ignores that diversity and violates the principles of federalism. He lifted a highlighted report. I have statements from election officials in 17 states warning that these mandates would cause logistical chaos. The Congresswoman's pushing ideology over practicality. Crockett listened calmly, letting him finish before responding. Interesting, she said, pulling a folder from her side. Because I have official letters from 23 states, including many led by Republicans, supporting these standards as both achievable and necessary. She turned directly toward him. But let's talk about consistency. Professor, in your 1982 book Rights of the People, you wrote, and I quote, "Federal voting standards may be essential when states repeatedly discriminate or fail. Administratively, you even endorse national early voting standards. Tell me, has the Constitution changed since then, or just your opinion?" The camera caught Dershowitz's brief flash of surprise. He hadn't expected her to cite his own writing. He fumbled with his papers before replying, "Academic thought evolves with evidence. The voting landscape has shifted dramatically since the 1980s. My earlier comments reflected the issues of that time." Crockett nodded, her tone measured but cutting. "So your interpretation of the Constitution changes based on political trends. That's quite a statement from someone who claims to be a strict originalist." The tension in the studio thickened. Rebecca jumped in again. "Let's move to another point. Voter ID laws. Congresswoman, critics argue that limiting ID requirements could weaken election integrity." "Those critics are ignoring hard data," Crockett replied. "Multiple studies, including from the Brennan Center for Justice, show that voter impersonation is virtually non-existent. What's real is that around 25 million Americans lack the specific IDs some states demand." Dershowitz scoffed. "The Brennan Center isn't exactly unbiased, and claiming that millions can't get an ID underestimates Americans' capability. It's insulting, frankly." Something flickered behind Crockett's eyes, anger, quickly controlled. Her voice stayed calm, but each word carried weight. "Professor, have you ever represented someone who lost their vote because they couldn't afford the paperwork for an ID?" "I have. Have you met elderly citizens born with midwives who never had birth certificates?" "I have. Have you spoken to workers who can't take unpaid hours off to visit offices that only open during their shifts?" "I have." Calling these barriers insulting proves the disconnect I mentioned earlier, the ivory tower mentality. Dershowitz leaned back, realizing he was losing control of the conversation. "Your anecdotes may be moving," he said tersely, "but they don't override the constitutional authority of states to preserve election integrity. The Supreme Court has repeatedly upheld reasonable ID requirements." Crockett leaned in slightly. "Then let's talk about the Supreme Court. In Crawford v. Marion County, the court upheld Indiana's voter ID law." "Yes, but it also made clear that the ruling was based on limited evidence of voter burden. When solid evidence shows disenfranchisement, the constitutional balance changes." She held up another document. "And since we're quoting past work, in your own 2005 Harvard Law Review article, you criticized judges who disguise policy preferences behind constitutional language. You specifically cited voter ID laws as examples where fraud prevention is used as a political smokescreen." Dershowitz bristled. "You're taking that completely out of context, am I?" Crockett shot back, raising an eyebrow. "Would you like me to read the rest?" "I have the full passage right here," Rebecca quickly intervened, sensing the perfect cliffhanger for viewers. "We need to pause for a short break," she said with a smile. "When we return, the debate over voting rights continues, and we'll take live questions from our audience. As the cameras cut to commercial, the tension in the studio didn't fade. Alan Dershowitz leaned toward his aide, whispering furiously while pointing to his notes. His assistant flipped through pages, searching for support. Across the table, Jasmine Crockett remained calm, sipping her water. A producer approached, asking if she needed anything. "I'm fine," she said softly. "But you might want to check on the professor." We haven't even gotten to the most interesting contradictions yet. When the broadcast resumed, the tone was different. Dershowitz had regrouped, his jaw set, eyes sharp. He turned to the host. During the break, I reviewed my actual writings, not the Congresswoman's selective quotes. My position has always been clear. Voting regulations must balance access with integrity. That's what the states are doing. He looked straight at Jasmine Crockett, determined to reclaim control. Since the Congresswoman wants to compare credentials, he said, his tone dripping with superiority. Let's be transparent. I've argued more than 50 cases before the U.S. Supreme Court. I've taught constitutional law to thousands of this country's most accomplished attorneys. With all due respect, your brief background as a state legislator and first-term member of Congress hardly qualifies you to lecture me about constitutional interpretation. The condescension in his voice echoed through the studio. Exactly what Jasmine Crockett had been anticipating. She straightened slightly, her expression calm but unyielding. "Professor," she began, her tone crisp and deliberate, "I think it's time we acknowledge the elephant in the room." Her words cut through the air like a blade. "The elephant in the room is that you're leaning on your resume instead of responding to my legal arguments. That tactic might work in a classroom where students are afraid to challenge you. But this isn't Harvard Law, and I'm not one of your students." A brief murmur rippled through the audience. Dershowitz's face stiffened. "I am addressing substance," he said defensively. "You're the one fixated on decades-old quotes." "I'm highlighting the evolution of your opinions," Crockett countered. "But let's stick to today's debate. You've argued that states should have broad discretion over election laws. Yet, in December 2020, you publicly claimed that state legislatures were not even bound by their own state constitutions when appointing presidential electors, a stance that could have voided millions of votes. She lifted another document from her stack. "Your own words, Professor. You wrote, and I quote, 'The Constitution assigns this power to state legislators, not the states generally.' How do you reconcile that with your newfound defense of federalism?" The veteran lawyer shifted in his seat, clearly uneasy. "That was a very specific legal argument about the Electors Clause, completely different from general voting regulations." "Is it?" Crockett pressed, eyes locked on him. "Both issues deal with the same constitutional principles, respect for federalism and protection of the fundamental right to vote. Yet your positions seem to depend less on consistent interpretation and more on which political outcome they support." A murmur swept through the live audience. Dershowitz's face flushed red. "That's an outrageous claim," he snapped. "My positions are guided by rigorous constitutional reasoning, not politics." Crockett nodded slowly, her expression calm but pointed. "Then let's examine that reasoning. You've repeatedly cited Shelby County v. Holder to justify reducing federal oversight of state election laws. But even in that decision, Chief Justice Roberts affirmed that Congress still retains broad authority to address voting discrimination, authority this bill exercises. And here's the difference, Professor. I've personally represented voters impacted by the fallout from Shelby County. I've seen polling places shut down in minority neighborhoods, voter roll purges that unfairly remove eligible citizens, and ID laws crafted with surgical precision to block the very communities they claim to protect." Dershowitz tried to interrupt, but Crockett raised her hand firmly. "Please, I listen to you without interruption." The professor hesitated, then stayed silent, perhaps recognizing the momentum had shifted. "You mentioned your Supreme Court experience," Crockett continued, her voice steady. "I respect that, but I've spent my career fighting for real people in state courts, helping elderly voters regain their rights and working families navigate bureaucratic barriers. Constitutional theory meets real life in those courtrooms, not just in academic debates." She picked up the Voting Rights Protection Act draft in front of her. "This bill doesn't federalize all election procedures as you suggest. It sets minimum national standards to prevent voter suppression while leaving states plenty of flexibility in how they implement them." Rebecca Mitchell turned to Dershowitz. "Professor, your response?" He cleared his throat, trying to steady his tone. The Congresswoman's experiences are touching, he said, but personal stories don't override the Constitution's framework. The fact remains, election administration rests primarily with the states. This bill goes beyond preventing discrimination and effectively micromanages local election systems. He lifted one of his documents dramatically. Section 306 alone contains 42 detailed federal mandates for early voting days and polling locations. That's not setting minimum standards. That's federal overreach. Crockett allowed herself a small, knowing smile. I'm glad you mentioned Section 306, Professor, she said, because that section was modeled after legislation you personally endorsed in your 1991 congressional testimony. At that time, you described similar provisions as appropriately tailored federal safeguards that respect state authority while ensuring fair access to the ballot. The entire studio went still. Crockett held up a printed transcript. This is from your testimony before the House Judiciary Committee dated March 14, 1991. Would you like me to read your full statement? Dershowitz blinked rapidly, visibly rattled. I'd need to see the full context of that testimony, he muttered. Of course, Crockett replied calmly, sliding the paper across the table. Take your time. As he scanned the document, the camera zoomed in on his face. Viewers could see the transformation, confidence melting into confusion, and then quiet disbelief. The text matched exactly what she had quoted. Crockett turned to face the audience and cameras directly. This highlights a deeper issue, she said firmly. Too often, voting rights are treated as abstract legal theories rather than the real protections they are for everyday Americans. The same legal authorities who once defended federal voting protections now oppose them, not because the Constitution changed, but because the political winds did. Dershowitz, scrambling to recover, straightened his notes. Even if I did support similar provisions back then, and I'd still like to verify that document's authenticity. The constitutional framework, he began, has evolved through later Supreme Court rulings. Crockett leaned forward slightly. Which rulings exactly, Professor? She asked with measured politeness. Because in Shelby County, the court made it clear that Congress still holds the authority to address voting discrimination. It merely required Congress to modernize the coverage formula for preclearance. And that's precisely what our bill does, based on current data about discriminatory practices. She turned to Rebecca Mitchell, the moderator. Rebecca, this isn't an abstract constitutional question, Crockett continued. It's about whether we believe that every American, no matter their zip code, work hours, or physical ability, deserves equal access to the ballot box. The Constitution's text and history both affirm that Congress has a duty to act whenever that access is threatened. The studio was silent as Crockett methodically dismantled Dershowitz's arguments. She cited case law, historical context, and specific sections of the bill with flawless precision. It was less a debate than a live masterclass in constitutional law delivered not from an ivory tower, but from someone who had lived the human consequences of those legal decisions. Each time Dershowitz tried to interject, Crockett calmly parried with facts, leaving him increasingly frustrated. Finally, in what looked like a desperate attempt to regain control, Dershowitz reached for what he thought was his winning argument. Congresswoman, with all due respect, he said, his voice tightening, I don't think you fully understand the unintended consequences of this bill. Section 502 could actually harm minority voters by diluting their representation in local elections. Crockett's smile widened slightly. Professor, I'm afraid there's a small problem with that claim. There is no Section 502 in this bill. The audience gasped. The bill, she said calmly, contains 428 sections in total. Dershowitz froze, then began flipping frantically through his papers, realizing too late that he had confused this legislation with another. It was a devastating error for someone touting superior expertise. I apologize for the mistake, he stammered, voice suddenly smaller. I meant Section 402, Crockett responded without missing a beat. Section 402 addresses ballot drop boxes, not minority vote dilution. Perhaps you're thinking of H.R. 2722 from the previous Congress? That's a completely different bill. The studio fell utterly silent again. It was the moment that defined the entire exchange. Despite his towering resume, Dershowitz had walked into a debate unprepared, relying on outdated talking points rather than the text before him. Crockett, on the other hand, knew the legislation line by line. Having helped draft several of its provisions herself, Rebecca Mitchell turned toward Dershowitz, sensing the weight of the moment. "Professor," she asked carefully after the Congresswoman's clarifications, "would you like to reconsider any part of your position on this bill?" Dershowitz hesitated, his legendary confidence now visibly cracked. "I still have constitutional concerns," he admitted. "But I concede that some of my earlier criticisms may have been based on incomplete or outdated information. I'll need to review the current version more thoroughly," Crockett nodded respectfully. "I appreciate that acknowledgement, Professor," she said warmly. "I'd be happy to send your office a detailed breakdown of how each section aligns with existing constitutional precedent. Perhaps we can find common ground in protecting every American's right to vote." Her graciousness in victory only deepened the contrast between the two legal minds, one clinging to credentials, the other grounded in lived experience and precision. As the CNN segment wrapped, everyone watching understood they had just witnessed something extraordinary, a generational shift in America's legal and political discourse. Within minutes, clips of Jasmine Crockett's takedown spread across social media. The most viral moment, her calmly exposing Dershowitz for citing a non-existent Section 502, surged past 1 million views in less than an hour. Hashtags like hashtag Crockett clapback and hashtag wrong Section 502 trended nationwide. Political commentators quickly weighed in. Conservative analyst Andrew McCarthy tweeted, "Regardless of your stance on the bill, Crockett just delivered a masterclass in congressional preparation. Dershowitz brought generalities, she brought receipts." On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow opened her show saying, "We just witnessed the legal equivalent of David taking down Goliath. Not with a slingshot, but with surgical precision." Behind the scenes, CNN producers who expected a dry policy debate were now racing to extend coverage. Overnight, they released a primetime special titled The New Defenders, Rising Voices Reshaping Legal Debate, featuring Crockett front and center. Meanwhile, in his Manhattan apartment, Alan Dershowitz faced one of the most humbling nights of his career. His phone buzzed nonstop with messages from journalists, colleagues, and former students. Harvard Law message boards lit up with professors noting how Crockett had turned the Socratic method, once his greatest weapon, back against him. By morning, Dershowitz released a brief statement. "While I maintain my constitutional reservations about federal election laws, I fully acknowledge Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett's impressive command of the material and her thorough, respectful debate. It was a rare concession from a man unaccustomed to defeat and a defining moment for a Congresswoman whose clarity, preparation, and conviction had just changed the tone of America's voting rights debate." The aftermath was nothing short of transformative. Within hours, Crockett's congressional office overflowed with interview requests from every major network. Her social media following tripled overnight, and her inbox flooded with messages of support, recognizing her new national influence. House Democratic leaders invited her to lead a press conference on voting rights legislation the very next day. Even more striking, 3 representatives who had previously hesitated to support the bill reached out to her office, now pledging their votes. What had once seemed like a long-shot reform was suddenly gaining real momentum across legal circles. The reaction was electric. Law professors, political analysts, and journalists dissected the debate from every angle. A Yale law scholar wrote, "Crockett proved that lived experience combined with legal expertise creates a deeper and more persuasive interpretation of the Constitution than theory alone." At Georgetown Law, a new forum was announced, Credentials versus Substance, Rethinking Legal Authority and Public Discourse. Inspired by the viral exchange, civil rights organizations like the NAACP and the Lawyers' Committee for Civil Rights Under Law issued public statements praising Crockett's arguments as reinforcing the constitutional foundation for federal voting protections. Meanwhile, voting rights advocates in Georgia, North Carolina and Arizona reported major spikes in volunteer sign-ups for voter education and registration drives, with many citing Crockett's passionate defense as their motivation. On the other side of the political spectrum, conservative media scrambled to reframe the story. Fox News host Lavra Ingraham argued that Crockett's gotcha moment over Section 502 didn't change the core constitutional debate. Yet even on Fox, analysts admitted the obvious. Dershowitz had been outmatched on substance. He leaned on reputation, acknowledged former Judge Andrew Napolitano, while she leaned on preparation. 3 days after the viral CNN segment, an unexpected headline appeared. Alan Dershowitz requested a private meeting with Congresswoman Crockett at her Capitol Hill office, arriving alone. Without cameras or aides, the veteran attorney spoke with a tone far more measured than before. "Congresswoman, I have now reviewed the entire bill. While I still have concerns about some sections, I must acknowledge that your constitutional analysis was sound. And your point about real-world impact, that law without lived reality has limited value, was well taken." Crockett, gracious even in victory, suggested something unprecedented. "Professor, perhaps we could co-author an op-ed highlighting where we agree while acknowledging our differences. The American people deserve to see that constitutional interpretation doesn't have to be partisan." After a moment's reflection, Dershowitz agreed. Their joint piece, published in the Washington Post under the headline, "Finding Constitutional Common Ground on Voting Rights," went viral once again. This time, the story was not about confrontation, but about intellectual cooperation. The op-ed opened with a simple truth. When debate centers on substance instead of status, on evidence instead of ego, democracy itself grows stronger. The two legal minds, once adversaries on live television, now stood together to show the country that even the sharpest disagreements could lead to mutual respect and progress. For Jasmine Crockett, the encounter marked not just a turning point in her career, but a transformation in how the nation viewed her leadership. Within a week, she received invitations to speak at Harvard Law, Yale, and Howard University. Law schools nationwide reported surging enrollment in voting rights courses for the next semester. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from thousands of young attorneys, law students, and women of color who wrote to thank her for her courage. "You showed us that we don't need to shrink ourselves or our experiences to face power," wrote one second-year law student from Michigan. Back in Washington, the political ripple effects continued. 3 Republican senators reached out to Crockett to explore bipartisan compromises on early voting standards. While major differences remained, the national discussion had clearly shifted from abstract theory to practical solutions, a field where Crockett thrived. At a Congressional Black Caucus meeting, veteran civil rights icon James Clyburn pulled her aside. "What you did wasn't just win a debate," he told her. "You changed the conversation for good. That's how real change begins." 6 weeks later, a revised version of the Voting Rights Protection Act passed the House with bipartisan support. Its Senate future was uncertain, but the bill now carried momentum that had once seemed impossible. Analysts credited Crockett's CNN performance for reshaping public understanding of both the constitutional principles and human realities behind voting access. In the broader media world, the Crockett-Dershowitz exchange became a landmark example in communications and law schools, a defining case study in how authority and public debate is shifting. Titles and credentials still mattered, but they no longer guaranteed dominance. What mattered most now was knowledge, preparation, and authenticity. For millions watching across America, the confrontation transcended partisanship. It wasn't just about law or politics. It was about who gets to speak with authority in a democracy, who gets to shape the national conversation, who gets to be heard. As for Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, reflecting with her staff one evening, she summed it up simply. "This was never about embarrassing Professor Dershowitz," she said quietly. "It was about making sure every citizen's right to vote is protected, not just in theory, but in practice. Because when legal theory meets lived reality, that's where justice truly begins. In classrooms and think tanks." The story of that CNN confrontation would soon be studied as a textbook example of how rigorous preparation, Moral clarity and real-world experience can outshine even the most established authority. It reminded the country of a timeless truth. In a healthy democracy, ideas should win on merit, not on the credentials of those who voice them, and as the national voting rights debate continued, one fact remained undeniable. A new, fearless voice had entered the arena, proving that the most powerful response to arrogance isn't anger, but being better prepared, more informed, and unafraid to stand your ground. The Crockett-Dershowitz debate also sparked a new wave of civic engagement. Voting rights organizations reported record volunteer sign-ups. High school and college debate teams analyzed the exchange, learning how to balance respect with assertiveness. In community centers from Atlanta to Phoenix, watch parties replayed the viral moments, inspiring conversations about the future of democracy. Crockett's story became a rallying point for those who had long felt sidelined by the legal and political establishment. She showed that you don't have to have the longest resume or the loudest voice to make an impact. What matters is coming prepared, knowing your material, and refusing to be intimidated by status or tradition. In the months that followed, Crockett continued to use her platform to advocate for voting rights, criminal justice reform, and educational equity. She became a sought-after speaker not just for her policy expertise, but for her ability to connect legal theory to real-world impact. Her approach, grounded in both law and lived experience, became a model for a new generation of leaders. Meanwhile, Alan Dershowitz's willingness to engage in honest dialogue, admit mistakes, and collaborate on solutions earned him renewed respect, even from critics. Their joint op-ed was cited in congressional hearings and legal journals as proof that adversaries could become allies in the pursuit of justice as the next election cycle approached. The legacy of that night in the CNN studio lingered. Candidates from both parties referenced the debate as a turning point in the national conversation about voting rights.
For many Americans, it was a reminder that democracy is not a spectator sport. It requires vigilance, courage, and a willingness to challenge even the most established voices. In the end, the story of Jasmine Crockett and Alan Dershowitz was not just about a single debate or a viral moment. It was about the enduring power of preparation, the necessity of humility, and the promise of a democracy where every voice, no matter how new or unexpected, can help shape the future. If you found this deep dive on the Crockett-Dershowitz showdown inspiring, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and tap the bell icon for more in-depth breakdowns of the political moments shaping America's future. Stay tuned as we bring you stories of rising voices redefining truth, power, and leadership in today's democracy.